Today, we're going to cover all canon lightsabers. If you think that I've missed any, or want me to cover any Legends types, make sure that you subscribe and leave a comment below. The lightsaber, sometimes referred to as a laser sword by those who are not familiar with it, was a weapon wielded by Force users, primarily the Jedi and the Sith. Whilst pretty much all lightsabers in canon typically consisted of a plasma blade powered by a kyber crystal, their hilt designs varied massively and said a lot about the user, whether they be Jedi, Sith, Inquisitor or other Force user. So let's get to it. The first lightsaber that we're going to cover is of course the standard lightsaber hilt. The standard lightsaber hilt would only produce a single plasma blade of varying colours depending on the colour of the kyber crystal within. Unless specifically modified, these hilts did not have an ability to change the length of the blade and were the most simple and therefore most commonly used by most Padawans and many Jedi Knights and Masters whilst operating in the field. The standard lightsaber, much like many of the other lightsaber types, could have its blade power turned up or down to assist with training and during practice duels. Very similar to the standard hilt is the dual phase lightsaber. This lightsaber hilt enables the user to change the length of the blade depending on the situation. Considered a product of a more violent time, only a few more experienced Jedi and Sith would use the dual phase lightsaber, as it allowed greater variability during combat. Both Darth Vader and Count Dooku famously used a dual phase lightsaber and would change the length of the blade mid-battle to keep their opponent guessing. Within the hilt, there needed to be at least two crystals, which could be moved nearer or further away from each other at the touch of a button or dial, which in turn focused and changed the length of the blade. Next up, we have a training lightsaber. The training lightsaber, as the name suggests, was primarily used by Padawan within the Jedi Temple during their lightsaber classes. The blade emitted was shorter and far less powerful than the standard lightsaber, and therefore wouldn't hurt or injure if a Padawan was to accidentally hit themselves or someone else with their blade. The hilt was generally shorter and lighter to reflect the shorter stature of the majority of the younglings. As previously mentioned, whilst a user could turn down the power of their standard lightsaber for training purposes, and therefore could be used in the field, a training lightsaber was solely for practice and would never be taken into the field. It is possible that the younglings fighting Anakin during Order 66 had not yet built their first lightsaber, so tragically were actually fighting him with training lightsabers. The next lightsaber is the double-bladed lightsaber. We see the double-bladed lightsaber being wielded by the Sith apprentice Darth Maul. Generally speaking, the double-bladed lightsaber had a longer hilt than the standard blade, as it had to account for the placement of an extra crystal and working parts. Essentially, the blade was actually two lightsabers placed together within a single hilt. This is seen as being the case when Maul's lightsaber is cut in half and one side of it is still functional. Whilst the double-bladed lightsaber was harder to wield and didn't necessarily add any real benefit to the user, it gave them a psychological edge, as others were not used to fighting against dual-bladed weapons and would typically only train against single-bladed. Whilst Darth Maul may be the most famous user, we also see Jedi Pong Krell wield a green double-bladed lightsaber during the Clone Wars. Next up, we have the double-bladed spinning lightsaber. This was a cruel and savage weapon famously used by the Inquisitors, who were tasked with hunting down the remaining Jedi following Order 66 during the Imperial era. The weapon could be used in three forms: single-bladed, double-bladed or spinning double-bladed. The hilt had a handle that was placed behind a disc that could spin when directly out to the front or to the side of the user, with the purpose of overwhelming and intimidating all that it came up against. As the Inquisitors were typically Order 66 survivors who had fallen to the dark side or had fallen prior to Order 66, they typically were not as strong as Jedi Masters that they came up against. For this reason, they usually operated in pairs, utilising and relying on the unique hilt designed to overmatch most opponents. Next up is the cane lightsaber. This was an extremely rare lightsaber hilt type that, as its name suggests, also functioned as a cane. This was generally used by older or injured Jedi who were more likely to require walking support rather than a lightsaber in their day-to-day activities. The cane lightsaber is pretty self-explanatory and is where a standard or dual-phase hilt is attached to or hidden within a wooden or metal cane. We actually see Maul use it within Rebels to appear weaker than he actually is to deceive Ezra. Less menacingly, we see the elderly Jedi Master Tira Sunube use one during the Clone Wars as his personal weapon, but also as a walking aid. Next up is the crossguard lightsaber, made famous by wannabe Sith Kylo Ren. The crossguard lightsaber was actually an ancient lightsaber design consisting of 3 blades, its main blade and 2 smaller ones omitted below forming a cross. The 2 shorter blades would serve to protect the user's hand and were just as deadly as the main blade. The smaller blades were tributaries of the main blade, focusing the plasma through 2 small vents, splitting the energy from the single kyber crystal inside. Kylo Ren's crossguard lightsaber actually differed slightly. Kylo Ren's lightsaber crystal was cracked, making it unstable. In order to vent the unstable and excess energy to prevent the lightsaber from exploding when it was ignited, the excess energy was vented. This was also the reason as to why his blade had that wild cracking appearance. Next up is the curved hilted lightsaber, as made famous by the elegant yet sinister Sith Lord Count Dooku. The curved hilted lightsaber was another ancient hilt design that was developed during an era when lightsaber combat was more frequent than it was during the Clone Wars. The slight angling of the blade made it difficult to fight against, particularly when dueling against less experienced lightsaber users. Much like the dual-bladed lightsaber, most Padawan and Jedi Knights would have only practiced against the standard hilted lightsaber, so they would immediately be at a disadvantage against the unconventional angle of the blade. It also enabled the user to manipulate the angle of the blade at a simple flick of the wrist, much like we see during fencing, allowing for rapid and quick movements of the blade. Other users of the curved hilt lightsaber were Asajj Ventress, and later on, following the Clone Wars, Ahsoka Tano. Curved lightsaber hilt favoured the lightsaber form 2, Makashi, that was developed for lightsaber to lightsaber combat and relied on precision and efficiency, focusing on balance and footwork. Next up, we have the lightsaber pistol. The lightsaber pistol was an extremely unconventional hilt and was most famously wielded by Ezra Bridger in Star Wars Rebels. After being apprenticed to Jedi Knight Kanan Jarrus, this was the first lightsaber that he built, by adding a stun pistol to the hilt of a standard lightsaber. This would have been likely considered highly uncivilized by the Jedi Order, as Jedi typically did not use blaster rifles or pistols. As Ezra was born after the destruction of the Jedi during Order 66, this hybrid design allowed Ezra to openly carry his lightsaber without others knowing what it was, without drawing attention to the fact that he was a Jedi. Similar to the pistol was the lightsaber rifle. Whilst not seen within the films, we see Jedi librarian Jocasta Nun in a Darth Vader Dark Lord of the Sith comics wield a lightsaber rifle whilst fighting against Vader in the Jedi Temple following Order 66. It is believed that this was actually an ancient design, and as Keeper of the Archives, Jocasta Nun had access to the vaults deep under the temple, and therefore had access to artifacts and designs. The lightsaber is actually placed within the rifle, and is then used like a standard rifle, the only difference being the shots are far more deadly and destructive. Whilst it is unknown how effective this rifle really was, it was used by Jocasta Nun due to her being overmatched by Darth Vader and knowing she stood little chance in hand-to-hand combat against his brute strength and skill. Vader, of course, used the Force to destroy it. Next up, we have a lightsaber pike. The lightsaber pike was widely used by the Jedi Temple Guards during the Clone Wars era. Whilst this design was based upon tradition and ceremony, it was also an effective weapon. While sharing similarities with a dual-bladed lightsaber, the pike had a much longer hilt and emitted slightly shorter but thicker plasma blades. The user could use a single-bladed or dual-bladed variant, controlled at the touch of a button. An extremely long weapon, the pike was primarily defensive and gave the advantage of keeping an opponent at much longer reach, and would be used much more effectively by teams. Whilst one user kept the opponent at bay, another user could move in for the kill or arrest. Next up, we have the light whip. Light whips were a heavily modified lightsaber variant. The internal workings of the hilt permitted the blade containment field to be flexible, allowing dozens of small emitters to create thin and flexible blades that could reach several meters long. Next up, we have the Shoto lightsaber. The Shoto lightsaber was much shorter lightsaber and therefore was wielded by smaller Jedi and Sith. It's also used as a secondary weapon in some cases for those who wielded 2 lightsabers. We see Ahsoka Tano use one of these as her secondary weapon during the Clone Wars, and we see Master Yoda use a Shoto lightsaber as his primary weapon, as due to his short stature, the Shoto was the perfect size. Other than its smaller hilt and blade, the Shoto was identical to the standard blade. It had a single crystal, and the power could be turned up or down depending on what it was used for. Finally, and by far the rarest of all lightsaber hilts, with only one of its kind to be in existence. That is, of course, the Darksaber. The Darksaber was constructed by the first ever Mandalorian Jedi, Tar Vizsla, that became the symbol of the Mandalorian people. It was believed that whoever had won the Darksaber in combat was the one who would lead the Mandalorian people. Built over a millennia before the Clone Wars, it was kept in the Jedi Temple after Tar Vizsla's death. During the conflicts between the Jedi and the Mandalorians during the Old Republic era, this was stolen back by House Vizsla and was then passed down generation to generation through Tar Vizsla's ancestors. Shorter than most lightsabers, it had an angular hilt that was made out of Beskar steel. It had a slit-shaped blade emitter that gave it its distinct flat blade shape. Single-bladed, it could not be lengthened or shortened, and the weapon would try to connect with the user on a subconscious level, becoming lighter or heavier depending on the wielder resisting or embracing the connection. So what's your favourite lightsaber hilt variant? Are there any that you would like me to talk about next time? Perhaps from Legends? If you've enjoyed, please make sure that you subscribe, like and comment. Thanks for watching as always.